Just moments ago, the president arrived back in Washington from Connecticut aboard Air Force One. And aboard Air Force One with him were a dozen regular people from Connecticut, 12 still grieving family members who lost a child or a spouse in the Newtown massacre. Those 12 people found themselves flying to Washington aboard Air Force One tonight because they are about to become congressional lobbyists for the week. And this moment, what's happening right now with those Newtown family members heading to Washington to lobby Congress, this is the tipping point in the long-fought battle over gun safety. And here's why. Let's be very clear about where we are on this issue. We are past that initial period of debating what kind of gun safety legislation is on the table. That's over. We know what we could get done on this issue, and we know the difference between real, meaningful gun safety legislation and the kind of legislation that will essentially be a victory for the forces of the gun power. The terrain we're fighting on is universal background checks, closing the gaping loophole to the country's current background check policies. But we are not fighting on the politics of closing the background check loophole, because that is massively popular, with 91% of Americans supporting it, including 88% of gun-owning households and 88% of Republicans. In other words, the background check issue has already been won politically, and it has already been won on the merits. There is simply no good, substantive argument against universal background checks. And if you don't believe me, check out the letter sent to Harry Reid by 13 senators who are threatening to filibuster it. Quote, "The Second Amendment to the Constitution protects citizens' right to self-defense. We will oppose the motion to proceed to any legislation that will serve as a vehicle for any additional gun restrictions." No one, so far as I'm aware, has ever argued or even pretended to believe they think that background checks violate the Second Amendment. If they think that, they should be filing suit against our current federally mandated background checks. Either background checks are unconstitutional or they're not, but whatever you think, closing a big loophole in those checks isn't the thing that tips the policy over from constitutional to unconstitutional. In other words, this letter is hand-waving and posturing. So the Republicans have lost on the politics and they've lost on the merits. And so the last refuge of scoundrels in all of political life, particularly in the era of Barack Obama's presidency, is, of course, the filibuster. The filibuster is the thing you do when you know you have losing arguments, or when you don't have arguments at all. Because what the filibuster allows you to do is quietly and routinely and boringly kill a piece of legislation without having to make an argument about why you're killing it. But the President of the United States understood, to his credit, from the very beginning, that this point we're at right now in this fight was exactly where we would end up. Right here, where we are right now, this is where the President started the fight. His target from the beginning was not the actual legislation or its opponents. It was, from the very beginning, the filibuster. It was getting an up or down vote.
If you want to vote no, that's your choice. But these proposals deserve a vote. Because in the 2 months since Newtown, more than 1,000 birthdays, graduations, anniversaries have been stolen from our lives by a bullet from a gun. More than 1,000. They deserve a vote. Gabby Giffords deserves a vote. The families of Newtown deserve a vote. The families of Aurora deserve a vote. The families of Oak Creek and Tucson and Blacksburg and the countless other communities ripped open by gun violence, they deserve a simple vote.
The President reprised that argument tonight in a speech delivered from Connecticut.
Some folks back in Washington are already floating the idea that they may use political stunts to prevent votes on any of these reforms. Think about that. They're not just saying they'll vote no on ideas that almost all Americans support. They're saying they'll do everything they can to even prevent any votes on these provisions. They're saying your opinion doesn't matter. And that's not right. That is not right. We need a vote.
The President has been fighting on this terrain all along, but now political processes have caught up to him. A filibuster threat is imminent, and since you cannot argue with a filibuster, what you can do is you can shame people out of a filibuster. You bear moral witness. You expose them for not having arguments. You can fly to the Capitol, mothers and fathers of children who were gunned down in a mass shooting, so they can spend some anxious, sleepless nights in a hotel and get up every day and get in a cab and go on the metro and go to Capitol Hill and through the metal detectors and head to the offices of everyone who's threatening to block a vote on this legislation, to the offices of Rand Paul and Ted Cruz and Mike Lee and Marco Rubio and Jerry Moran and Pat Roberts and Jim Imhoff and Richard Burr and Ron Johnson and Mike Enzi and Jim Rich and Mike Crapo and Dan Coates and Republican Minority Leader Mitch McConnell himself, so that those grieving family members can meet face to face with each of those senators or their staff and take out of their purse or their backpack a photo of their dead child and say to that senator or staffer, tell me why we cannot get a vote on this. Tell me that your response to this is a procedural mechanism of obstructionism. Tell me to my face that you will deny cloture. These family members did a version of that kind of lobbying in Connecticut last week when their state legislature was poised to pass gun safety legislation. And it was effective. The question is the opposition in Washington even shameable? Joining us from Hartford, Connecticut is Emily Nottingham. Her son, Gabe Zimmerman, was an aide to former Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords. He was one of 6 people killed when a gunman opened fire in a Tucson parking lot. With me here at the table, Maya Wiley, founder and president of the Center for Social Inclusion, and Leah Gunn Barrett, executive director of New Yorkers Against Gun Violence. Emily, I want to begin with you because you were in that room, and it was so striking to watch the atmosphere of that room and feel how palpably angry and passionate and loud that room was. What did it feel like to be in there?
It was very emotional. You know, there's so much support for gun safety legislation, and I could feel the pride of the people from Connecticut about what Connecticut did last week.
There was an arc, I feel like, as I thought about the just total pin drop sound of the room of grief when the president went to the school right after the massacre to talk to the victims and the victims' families there. And what has turned into something from that place of grief to this place of action that we are seeing embodied in the flight of these family members flying down to D.C. today. And you yourself have had that same trajectory.
That's true. You know, you begin with grief, and that grief doesn't go away. But at some point, you're able to get off of the couch and out of the house and ready to see what you can do to make a difference for other mothers in the country.
Leah, you too have had gun violence strike your life, and you're an activist on this issue. And you have done the thing that we saw a clip of in this amazing 60 Minutes piece last night, which I want to play a bit of. It is the surviving members of the victims going to lobby the Connecticut state legislature and bearing that moral witness to them. And I want to play a clip and then ask you how that's been in your experience. Take a look.
The lawmakers are going into their caucuses to discuss the legislation at hand, and the rope is there, I think, just to separate the various lobbyists who want to approach them as they go in there as a last-ditch effort to appeal to their cause. That's where we were. We had a letter that we wanted them to read, and we had pictures of our children to give them a personal connection to why we're asking them to go in there and legislate.
Why the photographs?
They need to not just look us in the eyes, but look our children and the lost ones and see those faces, see what's gone, and remember, this isn't just about political parties, this isn't just about careers, this is about people, and this is about making change to save people. And it's important to remember the people that you are doing this for.
You've been in the room having those kinds of conversations. How do they go? Do they work? Is there a way that you can push people to the right side of this legislation through this kind of testimonial?
Unfortunately, there isn't. No, there isn't. I remember being in Annapolis, Maryland in 2003. You remember the sniper shootings in D.C.? The 10th victim was a bus driver named Conrad Johnson, and his mother, Sonia Wills, was a very brave woman, had never lobbied before. We persuaded her to come to Annapolis. We were trying to get an assault weapons ban passed because the rifle used in those killings was a Bushmaster, very similar to the AR-15. And she came on numerous occasions. She had to give up a day's work, give up her pay to come and sit in the legislative committee room waiting to testify. And the chairman of the committee, I remember a guy named Joe Valerio, kept her waiting. And he was a Democrat. He kept her waiting for 6 hours one day until, you know, it was like 8 in the evening. for her to testify, which I thought was the height of incivility and insensitivity and rudeness. And I told him so. And of course, the assault weapons ban back in 2003 failed. The Maryland legislature didn't get out of committee, actually. It was 1 vote short. So I'm really pleased to know that it actually passed this time around many years later. But no, and I have been testifying before. I mean, I lost my brother in 1997. He was murdered in Oklahoma. He was shot in the head at his business one morning. And I've used that story to try to bring home, you know, the personal nature of gun violence. That it's not just the 20 little children killed in Newtown, but it's every single day at least 8 kids die, and many of them in communities of color. And would America really pay much attention if that classroom had been full of 20 African American kids in the center of Chicago? I don't know. I mean, that's a terrible thing for me to have to say, but I'm saying it. And I think what we have to do is fight fire with fire. If these guys in Congress who are so out of touch with the American people are going to filibuster it, let them, and we'll filibuster the filibuster. We'll bring victims, and we'll stand on the steps of the Capitol, and we will shame them, if they have any shame, victims and other legislators. Because, you know, frankly, I've been through this so many times, and it doesn't change. And the NRA, what they're afraid of is they're afraid, I think, of universal background checks. This is going to cut down on gun sales. Right.
And that's the real story, I think, of why one, the people who are victims sharing their stories is so important, but you talked, Chris, about what this moment represents, and I think one of the things it represents is it's not just that legislators are out of touch with the American public, it's that they're in the pocket of actually corporate interests. So rather than looking at what 92 to 97% of Americans support, you know, the National Rifle Association has been getting anywhere from $15 million to $40 million by some estimates, not from gun owners, from manufacturers. So they're actually not representing the interests of gun owners.
You know what I think also? I think if congressmen actually had to live in the gun-plagued areas of Washington, D.C., then they might change their tune. They don't. They live in a bubble. I mean, you have to go through metal detectors to go into Congress. You can't bring assault rifles into Congress. If they want assault rifles on the streets of America, then why can't we have them on the halls of Congress?
And what I find so interesting about the approach the president has taken on this is this asking for the simple up or down vote, which seems to me like wielding a crowbar against the vault of obstruction that has been the filibuster, which applies just past this legislation, right? This is the thing that they have used to kill piece of legislation, or to challenge it, or to tweak it, or to water it down. In doing this, in talking the way he's talking about this, he is making it no longer routine, right? He is highlighting the fact that there is something perverse and abnormal and anomalous
and fundamentally
about this.
Not democratic. I mean, that our democratic process isn't about whether I or any of us win on any particular issue that we want, but whether we're actually having a collective discussion about how we solve the problems, and that people be held accountable to their positions on them. I mean, because that's what the vote represents.
And have to vote on them.
Have to vote on them, because we know that come re-election time, we get to examine their voting record.
And I hope that we will actually hold them accountable, because I'm actually not terribly optimistic that significant legislation is going to pass this Congress. But we have to come back at them then and get them out of office.
Emily, are you prepared to sustain the kind of attention and to hold accountable in the future if this battle isn't won, to make sure that you're still around and still going at legislators months and years into the future?
Yes, I am. And I think it's important to understand that it's not all about this upcoming vote. There's so much riding on the upcoming vote, but there'll be future votes. And even though the NRA has a lot of money, if there are enough people who support an issue, you still have to get elected, and you still have to be voted for. And at some point, our senators and our congressmen are going to have to recognize that. We delivered 30,000 petitions that we collected in a week last week to our 2 senators' offices, and we're prepared to continue to do that.
The second part of this battle, I think, importantly, are the midterms, right? That if they are allowed to get away here with this obstruction, the only way to make real political change is to hold accountability moments in the midterms. Maya Wiley, the Center for Social Inclusion, Leah Gunn Barrett with New Yorkers Against Gun Violence, and Emily Nottingham, who is working with Mayors Against Illegal Guns. Great pleasure to have you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Upon hearing the news of former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's death, right-wing American Congressman Steve Stockman declared the best way to honor Baroness Thatcher is to crush liberalism and sweep it into the dustbin of history. I'll explain why he's right and why Margaret Thatcher saw you sitting and watching this program right now as the enemy. Next.